the war between Russia and Ukraine has long been something that has just been festering, and something that should have been over a long time ago. It's not in America's interest. We've cataloged that in detail. A lot of things have been happening both in Washington and in Europe that are further undercutting the likelihood that Western support is going to continue on. But those things don't seem to faze the leader of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who still seems intent on trying desperately to drag the United States into this war, which could spawn World War III. And we have with us today to try to examine exactly what he's doing and what the dangers are, Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, combat veteran, highly decorated combat veteran, and just all-around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
Well, listen, let's get right into it, because there's no beating around the bush here. A lot of things have been happening with the elections in the European Union about 3 weeks ago, the French elections a couple of days ago. Once they get changed or they get the third round or second round done here on the 7th of July, there could be more impetus against supporting the war. But there's also those people that seem just blindly to say, no, I want to keep supporting the war, both in the United States and in UK especially.
Yeah, I think we have to look at two columns. One column, positive developments, and another column, negative developments. On the positive side, what you and I and many people have been talking about for a long time is finally occurring. It's taken more than 2 years of sheer misery, economic deterioration, financial crisis to bring about change politically in Western Europe. Metternich, the great Austrian foreign minister, used to say, if Paris sneezes, Europe catches a cold. And it looks like Paris is once again leading the way. I would argue that this is not just going to change the French government. France looks like it's on the edge of a real revolution. Not only will Mr. Macron be gone, but I suspect the globalists collectively will be out of business. And to appreciate just how desperate Macron and his friends are, there are rumors circulating in French circles, not something you're going to read in the US media, but friends of mine in Paris and the French military have told me this, that these fools, the globalists that have been running the show and destroying France with immigration, spending, bad policies all around, and this Russian nonsense, are now talking about the potential to turn to the EU and NATO and ask NATO to intervene in France to keep Macron and the globalists in power. Now that's absurd. I don't see any evidence that any such thing could happen. But I think that tells you a lot about where we are right now in Western Europe. And after France, I would expect some things to happen in Germany and certainly in London. I think this Rishi Sunak is almost irrelevant, except that he's seen as constipating the system. So nothing can move forward, nothing can change positively, because he represents the same kind of failed policies and leadership that you have today in Washington with Biden, or Schultz in Berlin, and Macron in Paris. So I think we're in for a wild roller coaster ride from now and well into next year. But all of this ultimately bodes well for an end to the war in eastern Ukraine. And I think that's what's most important.
Yeah, that's certainly, obviously, we're all for anything that's going to end the war and end the pointless death and destruction of the Ukrainian population. But that'll come with a lot of resistance, because there are those who are just steadfast against anything that's going to resolve this and settle the war, most assuredly at the top with Volodymyr Zelensky, who I guess it was yesterday, or maybe it was even this morning. I didn't see the date on when this video was made, but he seems adamant that he is going to help force, he's going to get the world to force Russia into capitulation. Watch this.
The world has enough power to force Russia into peace. And in particular, defending the Kharkiv region from the Russian offensive, we have proven that the determination of our partners truly helps. Strikes on the Russian border areas helped protect lives. So will further decisions, the bold decisions that must be made, that we need and that we are discussing with our partners. In the coming weeks, we will continue our communication to achieve the necessary decisions.
So some of the stuff he says there is just self-evidently nonsense. You know that they have blunted the Russians in the north around the Kharkiv because there's no evidence that Russia, after about the 10th day of this offensive starting in May, had any intention of continuing to drive forward. In fact, they brought engineering equipment in to dig in after they got about 10 kilometers. So apparently that wasn't the plan there at all. But then he's a little bit coy, and this is part I wanted to ask you if you have any idea what he's thinking, where he's talking about bold new actions, because I know that there's some people who seem to want to try to expand this war and draw the United States in. I know that's something that he's been wanting to do, but what do you think he has in mind on that?
Well, I think that Zelensky is obviously on the edge of sanity at this point. Behind the scenes, the picture is very different from what you see in front of the NATO facade. The NATO alliance is collapsing. It's crumbling because people realize that we cannot do what we said we could do. Whereas we can't conquer Russia. We cannot compel Russia to do anything. He's saying these things as a matter of bluffing and to maintain the fiction that he's got a real government and a real army left. The truth is that the army is falling apart, and that's not the fault of the Ukrainian soldier. The Ukrainian soldier is brave and courageous and has fought to the bitter end, I think for the wrong cause, but nevertheless has done so. What you have instead right now is a situation where they're emptying places like Odessa and any towns and cities nearby, near the Dnieper River that they can find. There are still some men left, pushing them into uniform and then arguing that they're going to be part of a counteroffensive. In reality, they're not conducting any counteroffensives. They don't have the artillery ammunition for it, the air support. They don't have the air defense for it. They're just shoving these people into defensive positions until the Russians move forward, pulverize them, and then overrun them. It really is a tragic setting. So I don't think he personally believes any of it. I think he knows the facts. Now, what are the Russians doing? They do have this large force that's massed up in the northeast corner. They have essentially established themselves in front of Kharkov, and it was their hope that this would operate as a magnet for whatever Ukrainian forces were left that would then attack them, that allowing the Russians to annihilate the balance of the force. Some of that has happened. How much, I don't know, because I really think things are falling apart. Then you have the vengeance campaign. And that's really what these long-range strike weapons are all about. And they, of course, are designed to try and provoke the Russians into something that the Russians don't want to do, which is to go to war with us. However, it's becoming more and more difficult for the Russians to exercise restraint vis-a-vis the United States and its NATO allies because of this ISR complex of manned and unmanned aircraft, as well as space-based assets for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that collectively provide the targeting data and much of the intelligence that the Ukrainians need to stay remotely alive at this point. The Russians have said, if you repeat this performance with a Global Hawk or any other device, we will shoot it down. We responded immediately through Stoltenberg that we would provide fighter escorts to the next unmanned aircraft that we sent up. I hope that that is not true, because if it is true, the Russians will shoot them down. And then, of course, I think the effort would be to run around and say, see, the Russians have started the war. I don't think that'll work, because I don't see any evidence that the European populations are remotely supportive of a war with Russia. There's nobody that wants to fight. In fact, if they want to fight, they want to fight at home. They want to remove the governments that are oppressing them, exploiting them, and destroying them. That's true in Paris. It's true in Berlin. It's true in many countries, Stockholm, London, elsewhere. So I don't see it happening, but I'm sure that that's in the backs of some people's minds. And then again, keep this in mind. Someone asks all the time, someone on these talk shows, whenever I go on, what about the intelligence community? Doesn't the intelligence community provide accurate analyses that would clear up any questions about what we can or cannot do and what the Russians can or cannot do? And the answer to that is yes, those analyses are performed. But once you get to the higher echelons, the people there are worried about their jobs, and they know that the truth is unwelcome to the discussion that goes on at the strategic level. People aren't interested in the truth. They want to live in fantasy land. And that's where we're living right now in Washington, D.C. We continue to believe that we're the nation we were in 1991. And we continue to believe that the Russians are weak when they're not. I mean, it's the 5th largest economy in the world now. The Russian economy is growing by leaps and bounds. Ours is deteriorating. But nevertheless, they continue to pursue this ideological goal because they think anything they do is justified.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense at all, especially if they have accurate information. Now, part of me has all often thought that maybe there's just this delusion that they don't recognize the truth. But if someone's actually telling them accurate information on the balance of power and they're still going forward with the fiction, that can't be sustained. And at some point, they won't succeed and they won't be able to stay in power because the truth will finally crumble it, like what happened in Afghanistan in 2021. And that was a relatively small state. This could be catastrophic.
Well, I think that's really happening right now in Paris on the streets. You have the hardcore left, of course. That's part of the equation. But the majority of the population is discontented and frustrated with the government. The government, remember that Macron made all these ridiculous statements. I'm going to send 20,000 French troops immediately to fight in Ukraine against the Russians. What happened to that? Well, what happened to it was that the French Ministry of Defense said, have you lost your mind? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And we can't do it. We're not structured for that. Remember, as we've said several times, the French army is really structured to conduct safari in North Africa. The same thing is true also for the British army. It's not structured to fight a major conflict, and all the rhetoric in the world isn't going to change that in the short run. So I think the truth is out there, but the people at the top have rejected it. They simply say, no, that's not true. I don't believe that. And that may seem strange to you, but historically, there's a lot of precedent for that. Lots of people have said that over and over and over again.
Well, and we have a lot of it right here in our own country with the current administration, who seems locked in to, I don't know if they believe this fantasy that they're going to somehow turn things around or if it's delusion, but we do know a lot of it's going on. And during the recent presidential debate last Thursday, President Biden made some, curious claims about what's really going on the ground.
We found ourselves in a situation where, if you take a look at what Trump did in Ukraine, this guy told Trump, do whatever you want and do whatever you want. And that's exactly what Trump did to Putin, encourage him, do whatever you want. And he went in. And listen to what he said when he went in. He was going to take Kyiv in 5 days, remember? Because it's part of the old Soviet Union. That's what he wanted to reestablish. Kyiv, and he in fact didn't do it at all. He wasn't able to get it done, and they've lost thousands and thousands of troops, 500,000 troops.
Okay, first of all, Trump never told Putin to invade Ukraine. There hasn't been, to my knowledge, 500,000 Russian casualties, even though that's always in the news here. And then the third one is that I don't think that Putin is going to ever said they were going to take Kyiv in 5 days. I don't know where any of that stuff came from, but it seems that he believes it.
Well, of course he believes it. And to admit that that's not true would mean the collapse of his entire world view. I mean, it's all predicated on all these utter and complete falsehoods. But that's coming to an end. It's going to end in Paris first. It will spread to the rest of Europe after that. And ultimately, it's going to find its way to Washington. The sad part is that President Trump is also under the delusion that he is the quote unquote leader, director, orchestrator, whatever you want to call it, of the free world. He's not. Again, there's this supposition that we are living in 1991. We don't. Donald Trump has no more chance of ending operations in eastern Ukraine right now and shaping the outcome than Biden does. I mean, frankly, that's the truth. We've lost control, if we ever had it, completely, because no one trusts us. No one believes us. In fact, Putin made it very clear the other day, and I don't think it was just President Putin, but there's several leading Russian figures who said, quite frankly, what difference does it make who ends up as president? We've been down this road many times. Nothing ever changes. So we have to forecast the worst case. And that is that we won't get a serious strategic partner willing to negotiate. We'll be dealing with the same sort of delusional nonsense, and we're going to get ready for it. In fact, they're prepared to escalate and fight an all-out war against us, which is something for which we are completely unprepared. But we keep talking about it, and we keep making threatening moves that lead them to believe that that's what we want to do.
Well, and in fact, you couldn't have had a better segue into what we had next, because here's Biden saying that exact same thing.
The idea that somehow we are this failing country. I never heard a president talk like this before. We're the envy of the world. Name me a single major country president who wouldn't trade places with the United States of America for all our problems and all our opportunities. We're the most progressive country in the world in getting things done. We're the strongest country in the world. We're a country in the world who keeps our word, and everybody trusts us. All of our allies and those who he coddles up to, from Kim Jong-un, who he sends love letters to, and Putin, etc. They don't want to screw around with us.
Man, him saying we're the most powerful country and that everybody trusts us and we're always good to our word, even our adversaries like Putin in North Korea. Wow, that's a little bit disconnected from reality.
Oh, yeah, completely. We look at BRICS, this, which was initially Brazil, Russia, India, China. Now it's expanded to include Saudi Arabia. I think it'll ultimately end up being about 50 to 84 countries, all of which are interested in going to some new currency other than the dollar that's gold-backed or backed by some basket of metals or minerals. I don't know, but it's an alternative to us. The reason everybody wants the alternative to our hegemonic financial system is that we have bullied and mistreated everyone for years. We're telling the Russians right now they've got, what, 6 billion or 600 million? I don't remember what the figure is, some enormous figure of their money tied up in the Western financial system. Most of it's in Europe, and a lot of it is here in the U.S. in banks. And we've said we're going to steal it. Who is going to trust us or anything to do with the West if they see us steal Russian assets? And of course, the Russians will counteract. I mean, they'll come back and they'll not steal, but simply compensate themselves by taking over control assets in the oil and gas industries that are normally American or European. The sad part is it's all self-defeating. We've brought ourselves to this point. We've precipitated the emergence of these alliances. Was there an alliance between Russia and Iran 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Of course not, but there is now. Well, what about the agreements reached between Beijing and Moscow? And this is just the beginning. We're watching very carefully right now what's happening in Ankara, in Turkey, with President Erdogan. And Turkey is not just drifting. It seems to be on the march in the direction not just of the BRICS, but in the direction of a new alignment that is utterly divorced from NATO as well as the EU.
Yeah, Gary, if you could pull that headline up there from Erdogan that we had earlier, because he just made some news here in the last day or so because of increasing some cooperation with Syria, and I wonder if you could explain that you say a lot of things are can't be viewed in isolation. They have other connections. And I wonder when some of them look at this and they see Erdogan has something to do with Syria, they're like going, okay, well, that's something between them. But you say that there's some deeper issues involved here.
Well, certainly for the first, I would say 10 or 15 years of this century, President Erdogan of Turkey and his government were in strong agreement with both Israel and the United States that Mr. Assad should be removed from power. Now, Mr. Assad has survived in large part due to the support that he's received from both Russia and Iran. And Assad now, although still weak and still at high risk of any number of problems, assassination by the Israelis, assassination by Islamists, nevertheless, he's there. His government does function. The state is still intact. And suddenly now, Mr. Erdogan, who's been so radically opposed to Assad, has now said, no, I'm going to normalize my relations with President Assad, and his government. I'm going to recognize it as legitimate. Why would he do that? Well, he's doing it because the Russians and the Iranians have done that. And he also sees where things are headed in the region. He's watching us and our unconditional support for whatever the Israelis want to do. And the Israelis are leading this campaign of expulsion and murder in Gaza. And now they're prepared to spread the war through Hezbollah to the rest of the region. And Erdogan doesn't want to be part of the war, but he's certainly not going to go down as a result of it. So we've got a lot of things happening. And remember, I think I mentioned this on an earlier program. We, through U.S. Central Command, have worked very closely with the Israelis to prepare the Kurds in northern Iraq for a war with Turks. And they're actively preparing to attack the Turks. Now, why would that be? Well, I think it's because the Israelis have said, if we can divert the Turks' attention into the Kurdish problem, then it's less likely that they will involve themselves against us. However, at the same time, we have the Cypriot problem. And we mentioned this previously. Cyprus is the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean. Right now, there's plenty of evidence that the Israelis and we, the United States, are using the 2 British bases on Cyprus to support Israel in its war. Well, Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, pointed this out and said that he's going to regard Cyprus under these circumstances as a legitimate target. But it's really not that important to Nasrallah and Hezbollah, but it's very important to the Turks. And the Turks are very uncomfortable with that because, remember, Cyprus is divided into 2 parts. One is Turkish and one is Greek. And the Turks intervened there with very large troops and forces back in the 1960s to establish the current status quo. They're very, very sensitive strategically to what happens on Cyprus. So now you have a problem on Turkey's southeastern border with the Kurds. You have a problem in Cyprus and the Mediterranean. And all of a sudden, the long-term opponent of everything that Assad represents, Mr. Erdogan, turns around, does a 180-degree turn and says, I'm with Assad. What does that tell you? He's aligning with the forces in the region that are going to oppose Israel and us.
And, you know, Doug, you did touch on it, that there's a lot of growing anti-Americanism bands tied together. So there's the specific agreements between Russia and China, Russia and North Korea, Russia and Iran, Russia and Vietnam on some of the economic aspects, South America, Latin America, Africa. Those things are already expanding. And now that you're talking about more expansions going on in the Middle East with different organizations, but they still have this tendency toward the negative on the United States. Meanwhile, our leaders seem to be still oblivious to all this and keep the present administration that keeps thinking that we're the greatest country and that almost like none of these things are happening. But one of the things that Trump also said during that, which I think is in light of all of those things, is maybe a little bit more of a danger than some people realize. Some people may have said that this is just hyperbole, but I wonder your view on the backside of this, whether he's got something here about World War III.
And we're a failing nation because of him. His policies are so bad. His military policies are insane. They're insane. These are wars that will never end with him. He will drive us into World War III, and we're closer to World War III than anybody can imagine. We are very, very close to World War III, and he's driving us there. And Kim Jong-un and President Xi of China, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, all of these, Putin, they don't respect him. They don't fear him. They have nothing going with this gentleman, and he's going to drive us into World War III.
How much stock do you put in that claim?
This is campaign rhetoric. President Trump had an opportunity in Hanoi to sign a denuclearization agreement with the president of North Korea that would have fundamentally changed the entire climate and situation in Asia. And ultimately, Pompeo and Bolton succeeded in sabotaging that outcome, and he walked away from it. Now he's pointing to these things. Russia has always had enormous capability to escalate any conflict with us or anyone else in the world horizontally. In other words, they have trusted agents that they can hurl against us, in any number of different ways, not necessarily only military, but also economic and financial, diplomatically, strategically. And you pointed to it. You talked about Vietnam, and the Vietnamese have always been on very good terms with the Russians and historically very bad terms with Beijing. He just visited Vietnam, and he did not cultivate hostility to Beijing. He talked to the Vietnamese about supporting them against us and our influence. The same thing is true in North Korea. North Korea has always been the vassal state in many ways of Moscow. Moscow was ready to give it up, just as Moscow was anxious to give up East Germany in favor of siding with West Germany. Why? Because West Germany had the capacity to absorb the East and become a productive strategic partner for Russia. The same thing is true down in the Korean Peninsula. The Chinese would much prefer that South Korea absorb North Korea and become an effective strategic partner for China. The problem is we've sabotaged it. We've stopped it. Donald Trump had the chance and he threw it away to make that work. So I know what he's saying is designed to frighten people, and it should, because I don't think the people at the top of the administration really understand the gravity of their decisions. I don't think they understand what's at stake and how serious the Russians are. I mean, we've talked about this before. The Russians do not bluff. If they say they're going to do something, they do it. Now, they may not do it as quickly as you would expect or in the way that you anticipated, but they do it. And right now, everyone is ignoring the border. Mayorkas has thrown this thing open. Hezbollah has a major operating base in Mexico. Hezbollah has agents all over the United States now. They're not the only ones. ISIS is also well represented. Mexico is not friendly to us, and the Mexican government is a facade. The place is governed by the cartels. It's an organized crime state. No one brings that up. And apparently it's of no consequence to either candidate, because it's not enough to say you're just going to close the border in the future, which is what Trump says. If you close that border, you're going to be at war here inside the United States against the cartels, because they're making billions of dollars by supplying us with these terrible drugs that kill or addict American citizens. Once that money train stops, there's going to be trouble inside the United States. And now we have millions upon millions upon millions of people we know nothing about from all sorts of places in the world who are going to be operating inside the country. And we have no idea how many of them are going to align themselves with the drug mafias and help the drug mafias against us. We don't know. That doesn't come up for discussion. So he talks about World War III. You'll get World War III right here at home. That's where it's more likely than anywhere else. And frankly, the biggest danger right now is what's going on in the Middle East. Things in eastern Ukraine are winding down. There aren't very many Ukrainians left. Oh, sure, you have these annoyance revenge attacks coming from long-range strike weapons that we've given to the Ukrainians very stupidly so they can kill and harm Russian citizens, not necessarily Russian soldiers or Russian military capacity, because they can't do much against that. But they can certainly kill other citizens. Now, does Zelensky want to draw us into this fight? No doubt. But I don't think that we are so insane that we would risk such a thing in Eastern Europe. On the other hand, I see a lot of evidence that people are grossly underestimating the danger of what President Netanyahu is preparing to do by attacking Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And I wouldn't be surprised if that attack is not launched while he's visiting here in Washington. That would be the perfect time to do it, because everyone in the House and the Senate who's on the payroll of the Israel lobby will all stand up and cheer as they are attacking in southern Lebanon. That makes them unambiguously aligned with Israeli operations, puts us in a very dangerous position, because we don't want a regional war with the Muslim world. That's not our intention.
It's definitely not. It's certainly not in our interest by all measures. But in terms of Zelensky, I think that especially in light of what happened during the debate, it was just some interesting dynamics, because at first I think it was self-evident because of how a lot of the elections in Europe had been going back to the European Union and now then France, and then the Biden debacle here, because it was clear that the likelihood of him not even being in the election on November 5th is very real. And the chance of winning for anybody else is probably pretty low. And Trump is unequivocally saying he wants to end that war. In the immediate aftermath, for a moment, Zelensky looked like he might have gotten a little bit sober. Watch this.
We don't have too much time because we have a lot of wounded and dead people on the battlefield and through civilians. That's why we don't want to have this war during years. We don't have too much time because we.
So that's what he said right after I think actually the same day of the debate on the 27th. But 3 days later, he had an interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer where he seemed to like forget about all of that. And Gary, if you can bring up that headline there, he's lays out how Ukraine can still win as long as we lose our fear of Putin. And a couple of interesting things from this article I wanted to point out. First of all, he was asked, how can the Ukraine side overcome Russia's superiority and manpower? And he said, first of all, manpower, really, they have much more people than us, and we're really taking care of our people more. But today we have one dead Ukrainian for every 6 Russians, and the British intelligence says Russia are losing 1,200 men a day. Now, just, there's several other things he said there, but those things are just, number one, they can't be validated. But the first one is irrational as it can get, because at the same time, he's telling us they have a 5 or 10 to 1 disadvantage in firepower, depending on where on the front you're talking about. They simultaneously have a 1 to 6 advantage in casualties. That's irrational to even think that. And I haven't seen anything that says Russia's losing 1,200 men a day other than Western headlines.
Well, this is a narrative that is being spun up by MI6 in London and the CIA in Langley. That's all. And they are his handlers. He is their man. And he probably received a spanking verbally from whomever represents those agencies in Kyiv, telling him, don't go out and say anything like that. And clearly, Biden wants this to continue, at least in this current status quo, up through the election. Because after the election, frankly, nobody will care anymore in Washington. If Zelensky were to disappear the day after the election, along with his country, no one in Washington would give a damn. That's the truth. So this is all designed to prop up us, prop up Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, and maintain the fiction that something good is happening, which it isn't and never was. Look, when the Russians first went in, the big lie was an unprovoked attack. We all know that's nonsense. It was systematically provoked over many years. And in the year leading up to it, or the years leading up to it, you had from 2014 to 2022, effectively a low-level civil war where the Russians that lived in the east in Donetsk and Luhansk were being routinely shelled and attacked, killing at least 14,000 people. We know that that's a lie. So the Russians go in and they think, well, we're going to signal our seriousness. Surely the Western alliance will listen. And instead, what did they encounter? The exact opposite. And the West will continue to do this until the Russians put an end to it. And I think that's something the Russians know. And I think Mr. Putin knows it. It's distasteful to him because he doesn't want to kill people in Ukraine, never did. And he certainly doesn't want to advance further west. He doesn't want to have to manage or rule Ukrainians. That's as bad as managing or ruling Poles and Lithuanians. Wants nothing to do with it. So it's the big lie. It has to be maintained until the last minute. And the last minute or moment is what? 5 November. That's it, Dan. It's all about 5 November.
Yeah, more and more evidence supports that. And I guess to try to get to 5 November, that one of the other things, or the second thing about that article that really stood out was, Gary, if you could throw that second one back up there. The only possible negotiations Zelensky envisions would be talks based on his own peace plan, calling for full withdrawal from Ukraine, reparations, and justice for Russian war crimes. He's still holding off on that fictitious envision. This is again, even after the Biden fiasco last week, because he then met with, I believe it was the new not Slovakia. I'm sorry. one of the other new European leaders who came out and said, yeah, we support you in a new peace plan. So the one from Switzerland was a complete disaster, and now they're looking for a new one, and they just can't come to any kind of reality. But you still have senior Western leaders playing in with the fiction. And well, I guess the question,
Dan, it's a charade. That's all. And everything is designed to get to the next election on the assumption that if you can get to the election and win it, then nothing else matters. What happens the day after is irrelevant. This is the sort of short-sighted thinking. Remember, there is no strategy. There never was. The goal of defeating, destroying, dividing Russia, regime change was all nonsense. What's disturbing is when you look at that article by Trudy Rubin in the Philadelphia Inquirer, read through it carefully. It strikes me that there's nothing critical on her side of Zelensky. Does she point out that this man is essentially talking in a vacuum? He's delusional, that there's no chance whatsoever for him to survive or for his country to recover from this, that the Russians will destroy him? I mean, that never comes up because the entire world media, or I should say Western media, is devoted to the same mythology. This is the big problem we have. Americans and Europeans aren't hearing the truth. They have to fight for the truth. They have to get to it by looking at alternative sources. It's depressing, but that's where it is. What journalist with any professionalism would sit and talk to that man and not ask him hard questions and then print categorically his answers are disconnected from reality? Why not?
Right. Yeah. I in fact, there was one line in that article that I did just kind of make me cringe, is when she said, Trudy said that Zelensky said that these things were true. And when I was there on the ground, I saw them and realized he was right, which means she fell for that old dog and pony show where they bring you and show you what you're supposed to see. And then that's all you know. And because she has no foundation for anything else, she just believes it because that's what she was told, and her eyes saw something on the ground, which was not reality. But that's part of the plan. It's got to be intentionally designed, like you say.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I don't know what she saw. Did she go into a map room and look at where the stickies are on the map?
Right.
What the overlay says, all of which is nonsense. Did they fly her forward to the front? Doubtful. So that's all nonsense. She knows what she's there to do, and she's part of the problem. The media is a big part of the problem that we confront today. If you can distort information, if you can distort the truth, if you can subvert the truth, or better yet, block it completely, you have a chance of causing these kinds of things to last for years. And that's what's happened in Ukraine. If the American people had a clear picture from the beginning, we wouldn't have spent 2 days on the subject. We would have never gone there and never had anything to do with it. You know that.
Right.
We've lost control of our media. We've lost control of our government. This government's not interested in us. It's completely divorced from American national strategic interests. And
to a point you made earlier in this broadcast here about how Putin views some of this thing, he is a lot more clear-eyed than certainly most in the West. Here's what he said when he was in when he was in North Korea a week or so ago.
Time and again, the West is using its tired propaganda cliches, but they're clearly ineffective in realizing its goals, including in Asia. This confrontational policy pursued by the United States to expand its military infrastructure in the region goes hand in hand in the growing scale of military exercises involving South Korea, Japan, and they're clearly hostile with regard to the DPRK. Such steps undermine peace and stability on the peninsula and threaten the security of all the countries in Southeast Asia.
So you mentioned a second ago, Doug, that the new Minister of Defense, Bulasov, apparently told Secretary Austin that they're going to shoot down any drones that come up in the Black Sea anymore. Putin himself has said, I'm not going to necessarily say I'm not going to, I think you said, escalate laterally in terms of elsewhere around the world, people working against our intentions. The question is, how far will he go, and how far are we going to go before we finally try to test where his red lines are? That could, you said a second ago, forgive me for dragging the question out. You said a second ago you thought things were winding down. Is there a risk that while they're winding down, we could mess it up and actually expand it by getting involved?
Oh, yes, there's no question. In fact, I'm sure that is a goal. These intelligence organizations that are running everything in Ukraine, they're going to try to wring every last, what they consider to be benefit strategically, out of Ukraine that they can get. I imagine that if the Russians are compelled to advance all the way to Lvov, LIV, IV in Ukrainian, OV in Russian, in Western Ukraine, I'm sure that they'll retreat to Poland and then talk about the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces are regrouping for a massive counteroffensive to regain their country, and act as though this latest advance by the Russians is meaningless. This is what you're dealing with. And unfortunately, the American media is an arm of those agencies. It's eagerly reselling, repackaging these false narratives. I don't know what you do about it, but the danger is that we send up aircraft. We put another Global Hawk up or something like it. It is right on the edge of the air defense identification zone. It is actively communicating with Ukrainian ground forces or elements. And we send aircraft up to protect it, and the Russians decide to shoot them down. And it's what we were talking about earlier. I mean, the problem is this is not 1965. In other words, you're not going to be able to pull the wool over the American people's eyes the way you did in 1965 with that Gulf of Tonkin incident. You're going to have a tough time convincing Americans that we should go full blast to war against Russia. And again, all of us worry about the escalation to the nuclear level. And somebody asked me yesterday, do the Russians have more nuclear weapons and warheads than we do? And I said, yes, they do. And then, well, that's bad. You know, at some point, nuclear weapons are so destructive, as you know, Dan, whether you have 500 or 600 doesn't make much difference.
Right.
You've already got enough to destroy civilization as we know it. That's my biggest concern, that someone will lose control of that at the top of our structure. Russians aren't going to lose that because Putin's got his finger on it. And Putin is not anything remotely like what he's described as in the West. He's a very thoughtful, methodical, deliberate person. Everything he did, in fact, somebody said to me the other day, this is kind of frightening, I think Putin must be at heart an attorney at law. I said, why? He said, because he's so methodical. He goes through everything. And each step is carefully calculated and measured. Well, I think the attorney analogy is a disservice to Putin. But he is methodical and he's careful. And the last thing that he wants is a war with us and NATO. Makes no sense. Doesn't want it. And I think it's going to take changes in government in Europe to come to that same conclusion.
And I think it's important to point out he doesn't want it, but there is a line beyond which he can be pushed to where he'll take action anyway, because there's some in the West that think because he doesn't want it, he'll never take it, and we can be free to keep doing these ridiculous things that risk escalation. But
we don't know what that line is. I mean,
exactly.
I think we really don't know, because he's been so restrained for so long. We don't know what would happen if we sent up, 5 or 6 fighters, F-15s or something, to accompany a large drone like the Global Hawk. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't want to find out either.
Right.
In the last amount of time we have here, I want to shift gears just slightly. What you've kind of been alluding to a lot of throughout this episode here is that what the United States should do or shouldn't do to make sure we prioritize our national interests, and so we don't get sucked into something that would be decidedly counter to our national interest. You wrote about a week or so ago in the American Conservative an article called Ideas for Candidates Beyond Talking Points. And you list 10 things in there that there are recommendations and things that they should be talking about. I want to talk about 3 of these in particular because I think they're really relevant to what we're talking here. And number 1, you say, basically, instead of worrying about Ukraine, we should be securing America's borders.
No, that's right. We not only need to secure the borders, once we do that, and it's going to take military power to ensure that it is actually secured, and that's probably 40, 50, 60,000 troops. We also have to secure our harbors, our ports, because a lot pours in through our ports like San Francisco, New York City. We have to secure the Canadian border as well. If you go up to the Great Lakes, that area is being a major drug supply route for a long time. So we have a lot of work to do around our borders and littoral waters. The United States Coast Guard that's running around in the South China Sea or the Persian Gulf needs to come home and do its job where it belongs here in the United States. Those kinds of things have to happen. But we've also got to expel the people that have come here illegally. These people can't stay. If you look at the state of our economy, the fragility of our financial condition, leaving these people here is a catalyst for serious trouble and unrest. We're not, daddy warbucks that can afford to do everything contrary to what Mr. Biden and his friends think. And there are ways to do this. You can give everybody 90 days to get out and then tell them that those of you who register on the way out with us, we'll put your names on a list. And at some future point in time, hopefully in the next 5, 10 years, whatever it is, when we are in better financial condition and better economic situation, we can consider readmitting you legally. And anybody who refuses to do that, well, you're going to have to incarcerate them and then forcibly expel them. But that's the sort of thing we absolutely have to do. That's the number 1 priority, or this country will go away. Our no borders means no country, ultimately.
Yeah. And Gary, can you bring that list back up again? The second one you have there is defend America first. I wonder if you can explain what your intent is with that.
Well, we've been through a long period now, certainly beginning, I would say, in 1965 with Vietnam, of military adventurism, military interventionism. In other words, spreading democracy and American notions of governance at gunpoint or bayonet point. That's really got to end. It's absolutely got to end. And we need to take a different approach to the rest of the world. We need to make it abundantly clear that unless someone attacks us directly or attacks our vital strategic interests, and we need to identify what those are, and we can do that, we're not going to use military power. That has to happen. See, the whole world is sick of us because at the drop of a hat, we commit to U.S. Armed Forces to bully our way in and to bully people everywhere to do what we want them to do. We've got to stop that. So defend America first means exactly that. We're going to defend ourselves in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to defend our interests, defend our citizens, and we'll do that vigorously. But we're going to stop intervening in and operating in other people's countries because it's lawless. It needs to go away.
And it's so ironic that our actual laws, not to mention the Constitution, but the 1973 War Powers Act expressly states that, number 1, only the Congress has the power to declare war to bring us into conflict. But secondly, even in emergency situations, the only authorization is for use by the administration is if we're being attacked or an imminent attack or our soldiers or our interests elsewhere. That's it. There are no other exceptions without having to have a pre-authorized from the United States Congress. So basically all you're saying is let's follow the laws that we have, and that would be a lot better at it.
Well, yes, although I think we should say as a priority, defend America first. In other words, hemispheric defense, number 1. And that means we don't need all of these bases overseas. That's the legacy of a world that doesn't exist anymore. And you and I have talked about it, how profoundly technology has changed military power as well as economics. And we've got to come on board and understand that. So the notion of all these forward deployed forces as vital to our security is exactly wrong.
Yeah.
The opposite is the case. And whatever you have forward in the event of a real conflict is probably going to go away quickly. That's the issue.
And I think that tails into the third point that I wanted to look at. Jeffrey, thank you there. You say you want to build new armed forces for the 21st century. So I wonder if you can explain in the time we have left. I know that's a big point there, but what is your position that we should do to change?
Well, keep in mind that whoever is elected or whoever ends up running the country in the near future is going to confront a terrible situation from a financial economic standpoint. You cannot do what Donald Trump wants to do, cut taxes and sort of march down the Reagan-esque road. That's what Liz Truss did in England, and she was summarily bounced out of power for it. That's not the answer. We're going to have to radically cut spending. We have effectively $1 trillion defense budget. And I say $1 trillion because I lumped the intelligence agencies in with the Department of Defense. You add it up, it's $1 trillion. That has to be cut in half. Think about that. You've got to cut $500 billion out of that. You're going to end up having to deal with entitlements. And we have at least 2,000 programs that fall into that particular category that nobody wants to touch. Everybody's afraid to touch it. It's going to have to go. So the military side is not going to be immune to this sort of thing. Remember, this is the guns versus butter problem. George W. Bush decided we could have both guns and butter. And here we are, 22, 24 years later with guns and butter, and we're broke. The machine is going to seize up. It's unsustainable. What did Ben Stein say? You know, when something can no longer operate, it stops. Seems self-evident, but he's right. Ben Stein's right. We're just going to stop dead in our tracks. So then you have to cut everything dramatically. When you begin to cut things dramatically, that means you have to scale back your strategic interests and expectations. And our strategic interests have been global military hegemony. Well, that's absurd. You know, it always was crazy. So we don't want it. We don't need it. And the world doesn't want it. So we're going to have to re-examine how much we spend, where we spend it, how we spend it. Now, I haven't even talked about the technological aspects. I'm just talking on the highest level strategically. That's what we're looking at in the next year to 2 years.
And so now when some people hear cut the defense budget, they automatically think, and certainly a number of people will actively facilitate this thought that, oh my gosh, you're going to make us less secure. So how do you argue that cutting the defense budget can actually make us more secure?
Well, $1 trillion defense budget apparently has failed miserably to secure us, because we're told every time someone testifies from the Department of Defense that we have all these enemies all over the world for which we have to arm ourselves to the teeth, and then we have to be prepared to preemptively attack and destroy them. Now, this is nonsense. So you're talking about a change in the threat picture, and that change is we have to live in the world that exists, not in the fantasy world that Washington prefers. And that fantasy world is everything is being forcibly shaped in the direction we want it to go. And we have this amazing military establishment that can destroy and kill anybody. Therefore, everybody has to do what we say. Those days are over. This is really what Putin was trying to say. He's not the only one. I listened to the foreign minister from Singapore say the same thing. You know, we are clinging to this post-war so-called liberal international order. We can debate whether or not that nomenclature makes any sense, but it's gone. It's over with. And this all emerged when we were the last man standing at the end of the Second World War. And that's all gone. So that is the first thing, is to re-examine the world and see it as it really is, and understand that it may be a far better way to operate without provoking wars, without precipitating interventions, without preemptively striking. We'll end up living in a much better world. We managed to live in that world very successfully for a long time, and the world loved us. There's no reason why we can't do that in the future. But we can be prudent about it. But we should be most prudent about defending ourselves at home, our territory, our citizens, and as I said, those vital strategic interests, which have a lot to do with access to the global commons, space, ocean, sea, resources, and so forth. And then you have to re-examine what we're doing on the battlefield these days. I mean, the U.S. military is not organized, equipped, and structured to fight effectively in this new environment. And if you want to know what that new environment is, look at Ukraine. And imagine that new environment, which involves top attack from all sorts of weapon systems, is only going to grow more lethal in the future. So how do you deal with it? And I always try to point out that the size of our theater, air, and missile defense investment and force is almost exactly what it was 30 years ago. That's ridiculous. But that tells you something about the mindset in the Department of Defense.
Yeah, it really does. And I remember when you came up with a lot of these Transformation Under Fire and some of these other books that you had about how to reorganize and refit the U.S. Armed Forces. It always struck me that by having a concurrent change of structure with a strategy would make us stronger and cost a lot less. And that's the irony of how this could all work. That
well,
it's
Dan,
counterintuitive to a lot.
Dan, thanks for saying that, because if I were going to pick a good example of it, where it worked very effectively, it's actually an example of Lenin in 1923-24. Remember, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists ended up fighting all sorts of internal enemies, killing millions of people, but they also had to face some external enemies. They had the Japanese that entered eastern Siberia. We came in against them along with the British and the French and others in northern Russia. Ultimately, it all failed and the communists came out on top. But to fight and win that war, the communists had to raise the size of what we would then have called the Bolshevik armies or the Red armies to about 6 million. And then by 1922-23, it became clear, having won, that they were going to have to dramatically reduce that. And so Lenin reduced the size of the so-called Red Army, which at that point was a little over 5 million, down to 600,000. Now, keep in mind that Russia, or the Soviet Union at that point, was the largest country in the world in terms of landmass, bordered more countries than any other country in the world. And yet they were able to go down to 600,000. Suddenly, all the external enemies, which the communists had ranted and raved about, were no longer the issue. The issue was, we have to extract savings. We have to husband resources so that we can build the scientific industrial base that we need for the future. And so that 600,000 man force in the Soviet Union actually became the small seed that grew by 1939 into several million men and a modern force with all of the equipment that we're familiar with today. Well, we need a similar approach, because most of the equipment we're using is not designed for this new world that we're living in. And it's going to take time. But your first step is much like what Lenin said. And just do the math and look at going from 5+ million down to 600,000, and remember who they are, where they live, and the numbers of countries they border. And they managed to do that and pull it off successfully. Certainly, we could do at least that well. And I'm not saying we go down to 600,000 men, but it may end up being something like that. And that's the model I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I really reinforce the necessity of changing the strategy as well, or having one, I guess. In that,
and remember,
instead of saying everybody's our enemy everywhere.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the strategy up until that point was to expand the revolution. In other words, we're going to carry the Bolshevik revolution on our bayonets through Poland, into Germany, and all over Europe. Well, that failed. They were annihilated in front of Warsaw by the Polish armies. And at that point, everybody said, wait a minute, this isn't working. We can't conquer the world with the forces we have. And they fell back into the Soviet Union. And they changed their strategy. And eventually, Stalin called it socialism in one country. In other words, homeland defense. That's where we're going to focus. And that's what we need to do.
That is what we need to do. And I'm sure grateful for you to come on today to try to explain a lot of this, keep us out of these ridiculous wars that we have, and keep us from starting any new ones, and keep us safe at home. That's a good prescription that I'd like to see is fulfilled, whoever wins the White House in November. But thanks for coming on today, Doug. I really appreciate it. We always invite people to go see Our Country, Our Choice, because I know you got a lot of things going on over there. You're trying to make some positive changes within the country. At the same time, you're trying to keep us safe outside of it. We always appreciate that and invite people to go check it out as soon as they get a chance.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. And we invite you guys to stick with us here, because we got some really good shows tomorrow. We got Colonel Jacques Beau, one of our favorites from our fans here. He's always got some great stuff to say from a European perspective. And Ted Postal, the MIT professor, who always has an interesting way to look at things that goes much deeper than you see in any of the mainstream media. We're going to get to that tomorrow as well. Thank you very much for joining us. Be sure and like and subscribe on your way out, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.